loving Father, generous Father, creating Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What is my call? Is that a question you ask? What are you directed to do internally? Let me tell you about an experience I had just last evening. One of my rituals is that before I preach the night before, I go through the sermon, which has previously been written, and then I go to bed. And as I read through the sermon, a voice in my mind came to me and said, "Not on the light. I don't like that. Do something else. Say something else." This has been an extraordinary week for this congregation. And so the Spirit directs me to say something else. Perhaps to share some random thoughts. Perhaps in a way of giving thanks to God for the experiences that we've had. To acknowledge with thanksgiving a pastor who's been with this congregation for a long time. And so I will share some of the experiences that I had, because my experiences in this congregation is relatively recent. We came to the congregation in 2012. I believe we came at the same time the Haldeman's came. And we redid our affirmation of faith, which is sort of an abbreviated baptism, but re-emphasizing our call. And as we sat and talked before the affirmation, I had started to come to the Wednesday evening services, those prayer services. And Pastor asked me once if he could come and visit. And so just after Wednesday evening service, before I could get home, he was there. And he talked to us. And we talked about all of the things that he had said and that we were hoping for in a congregation. And one of the questions he asked was, "How did you find us?" I said it was simple. We went on the internet. And we asked the internet to give us an ELC congregation that was within 12 to 15 miles of our house. And yes, the internet did give us those congregations. They gave us one in Allsdale. I had no idea where Allsdale was. They gave us one on Cascade. We knew about that one. We had attended many years ago when we visited our parents in Atlanta. But they gave us this one, the one in Riverdale. We knew nothing about it. And we looked at it, and quite frankly, we saw that the web page was a little bit dated. But we decided, let's give this one a try. We were disturbed, and one of the first questions we asked Pastor about was about communion, because the congregation that we belonged to in Illinois had communion every week. And Pastor said, "Have no fear. We have communion every Wednesday and twice during the month. And so we in fact have communion all the time. That should not be a worry." And then he started to describe some of the people in the congregation. He said, "We have beautiful people in this congregation. People who are dedicated. People who take their call as Christians serious." He said, "But we also have some who don't take those calls very serious. I won't point them out to you, but you can find out who they are if you decide to join us." So after we laughed about that, we decided on that date, and as I said, that date was what was listed, and we went through the affirmation of faith to join the congregation. What I didn't tell Pastor Jeff was that I had also started a new experience with a seminary out in Berkeley, California. I'd always wanted to go to Berkeley, California, but I didn't think I was radical enough to go out there. And so I did. But the program was like an executive training program that I'd had several times on several different subjects. And it called for not being there every day of the week, it called for demonstrating, first of all, that you had leadership capability, and secondly, that you were dedicated to the Church of Christ. It also called for the enumeration of various experiences. The interview was a long interview, but nevertheless, they were able to get what they wanted out of me, and that was information. And so I enrolled with the, I think, the radical seminary in the ELCA, the one out at Berkeley, part of the Graduate Theological Union. We had fun. They placed me in a cohort with two MDs. One was a gynecologist. We have not figured out yet how she was able to run a church full-time and her practice part-time. The other one directed the crime labs for the state of Washington. Not Washington, Montana, I'm sorry. And the other one was directing labs on an Indian reservation, a PhD level scientist there. It was an odd group. And some evangelists from, of all places, Sudan. It was a wonderful experience, but it called for something else. Being on campus only 3 times a year for 1 week, we had to have a mentor. And at that point, I was reluctant, but I asked Pastor Jeff, would you mentor me through this process? It would probably take me 4 or 5 years, but would you do that? Because I was working full-time for the bishop at the same time. And Jeff enthusiastically said, yes. So I asked the next question, are you willing to take me on as a student in the congregation, doing the things that pastors do in congregations as part of my training? And he said, I'm willing to, but I think we need to speak to the congregation as well. And so we went through the council and we went to the congregation, and he sent me outside while you guys were voting, and you said yes. In fact, not only did you say yes, you asked me if I could start next Sunday. It was an interesting time, but his comment was, what I want to do now is to change you over from a scientist, from a student, now to a pastor. And those things are quite different. The roles that you play are quite different. And I asked, how are they different? And he said, because now you will be responsible. You will be called to take care of God's people. Those people you like, and perhaps those people you don't like. Those beautiful people we talked about, and perhaps those people who are not so beautiful. But you will be responsible for delivering care to God's people. And that went on. We met dutifully every Tuesday morning at 9:30 for 1 hour. Now this was very taxing for Pastor Jeff, because he had calls to make, sermons to write, things to do that occupied his schedule fully. But every Tuesday morning, we sat and went through the various assignments that I had. Kitty tells me, or she told me then, that he found that so exciting because he was getting to read all of the new material and study all of these textbooks like 30 years later. And he was excited. Oftentimes, Pastor Jeff would be 2 or 3 books ahead of me. But nevertheless, we got through that. Then the seminary issued him an invitation to come out to Berkeley, to go through the program, to see what is expected, and to prepare himself to read papers. Every paper that I wrote had to go through him first, and he had to comment. And I was called on to correct anything that he had before we could give it to the professor. And that went on fully for more than a year. I recall the first paper that I wrote, which was a funny experience, because as a scientist and as head of research and development for North America, for the pharmaceutical company, I was used to writing papers. I was used to talking to government officials, used to doing all of that, used to going back and forth to Europe. But the first paper I wrote, which I thought was pretty good, Before he handed it back to me, he said, "How sensitive are you about criticism?" That gave me an indication of what was to come. He handed me a paper, and I looked at it, and I took the paper like this. It was my paper, but it was a sea of red ink on it. Challenges to the theology, and challenges to the way I said things. You could do this way, I would say it that way. So that was the first experience. The next paper was much better. And it went on and on like that. But Jeff tells me, and one of the professors that I still communicate with each week out there, he said he was the most enthusiastic pastor who came, who was a mentor. Not only did he have questions, but he participated and actually started to teach us. Started to teach us things about people in congregations. So Jeff went through that training and came back and made things much easier. He knew things about the candidacy process that local people did not know. He knew that not only because of his experience at the seminary, but his experience with people here at Christ Our Hope. And so we'll be forever grateful for that experience. He was there for the ordination, and many of you participated in that. One or two of you actually came to us as we had finalized the ordination surgery. And just after the service, one or two of you came to us and said, "We're glad you made it long and uncomfortable. We're glad that you included music from every corner of the world in that, because that's who we are here at Christ Our Hope." Bishop Gordy, who officiated at the ordination, said that it's the only congregation he has ever seen that had music from all people, that had people in it that reflected what the world is like now. But the one thing that was funny, that was said by one of you, and I won't identify you, you said, "We're glad you did that service the way you did it, because people up north think we're stupid." Now, he wasn't talking about, Ohio or Indiana. He was talking about Atlanta. He said, "They think we don't know how to do anything, but we showed them, didn't we?" So that was the beginning of that relationship. And after a year and a half or so, the times changed, and it was not necessary to have those meetings once a week, but nevertheless, we still had them. And the way he handled that part of the team program has now been found itself into the program out at Berkeley. It is still expected that students will sit down and talk with their mentors or their pastors at least 1 hour a week. It is still expected that the pastors will have a close relationship with the students and members of the congregation. And we have that. And again, I'm grateful. So what else can I tell you about that relationship? That was a relationship, I think, that answered a call that I had. And I don't know where the call came from, but it came. But I'm sure it came from a call that he had to actually serve God's people, to take care of God's people, and to transmit and to transfer those experiences from him to another person. Again, thanks be to God for that experience. So this morning, what is your call? What are you called to do? What do you do that you're not necessarily paid to do? Sometimes we think of calls as something that's reserved only for missionaries and for pastors or church people. But each one of us has a call. Some of you are fulfilling that call. Some of you are in fact feeding the hungry, taking care of the sick, visiting the shut-ins. Some of you are doing that. Some of you are doing that very well. And some of you take that almost as if a job, as if it were a job, but you're not paid for it, but you do it. You do it because there is a need. You do it because there is love in your heart for that. I remember, and I say this almost weekly, when COVID was at its height, I remember very well the difficulty many of us were having in finding a place to get the vaccinations. And we shuddered at the thought that we would have to go to Mercedes-Benz Stadium and stand in line with thousands of other people. And some of you identified places in this area and south of here where there would be no waiting. You were not selfish. You freely gave the information, and that information went all over the city. That is the kind of thing that I can remember with gratitude. One of the last conversations that I had with Pastor Jeff was a comment on how people were stepping up and how people were caring for each other. And his comment back to me, as he struggled with these words, I hope and I'm glad that you see that. Sometimes I get the impression that people don't see that. But people do, in fact, take care of each other. And people do, in fact, live through their call again to serve the people of God. Now back to this matter of calls. Many of you don't know that I probably had 13 or 14 different calls. That may sound funny to you. But when I went to graduate school, they asked me during the application process, why do you want to do this? Why do you want to put yourself through 4 or 5 years of rigor like this? What is your ultimate aim? My ultimate aim, as I explained to the professor, was that I wanted to help alleviate pain and suffering in this world, among the people of this world. And he said, you've come to the right place. My students, however, are not regular students. My students will make a difference in this world. Last October, as he was retiring, I was called back to speak on his behalf for the graduate students that he had. And I reminded him that he said that my students will make a difference. And he shouted out, I did not think, though, that they would change from science to theology. And after we laughed over that, my statement was, what difference does it make? We're all in the business of caring for God's people. And in that journey, and he walked with that journey too, even up to the point of here at Christ Our Hope, he walked with me. He became famous and wealthy with his inventions. But all in all, he said, my students will make a difference. They will make a difference in terms of what they contribute to the area, the scientific area, and what they do in the world. Shortly after I left Brookhaven National Laboratories in New York, I went to KKK, a very small company, a pharmaceutical company, to set up a lab there. And about 18 months later, 3 pastors visited my house. One with this big hat that I won't forget, but one from the largest Baptist congregation in the city. Even back in the 70s, they had 3,000 or 4,000 people, members. And they came to me to ask me a favor. They wanted to rent my name. And I reminded them that I hadn't been in town that long. So, renting my name, that would be not much value. And they said, we didn't intend to pay you anyway, we just wanted to ask you this. And it turns out that the town was in an uproar. There had been an election there. And for some reason, about half ballots from one precinct were discarded. And there were court cases flying everywhere. The lawyers made a fortune on all of this. But the people sued whose ballots were discounted. They lost the first round, but they appealed, and on the second round, they won. And this is what these pastors were asking me to do. There were certain political pressures and economic pressures put on the leadership that were heading the lawsuits. And so they asked me if you would stand in and administer these things for us. And I said yes. It was crazy. It was stupid. It was completely out of an area that I had training for. But we did it. And upon appeal, we won. Then the Board of Education and the Election Committee appealed to the Illinois State Supreme Court. Upon doing that, the Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal, but instead they wrote a 20-page stinging criticism of the Board of Education and the Election Commission, reminding them of the fundamental aspects of voting. Now this was back in 1974. Now what was left for me to do as president then of the NAACP that was sponsoring this whole effort? We had to raise money to pay off the initial court cost and then the lawyers. But that set a precedent for what had to be done. And on and on and on and on things went with calls. A call to rebuild that branch of the NAACP, which had all of 25 members when I went in. We ended up with almost 450 members at the end of the year. A call to restore pride for people who had been disenfranchised and who had been pushed aside. A call to continue to work with the Board of Education there, with a consent decree that they had with the Department of Education and the Illinois State Board of Education to straighten out the messes that had been created. This was a call. The next call came from the Martin Luther King Jr. Foundation for that county to act as its treasurer. And sometimes I think God was playing with me, because when I went to check the balances in the accounts, I found the total assets in all accounts for that foundation amounted to about $53.59. I remember that because it shocked me. And I had to figure out and call home to see if I could actually make a deposit into the account for the foundation. But over and over again, there were those calls. There was a call to serve as founding president of the Youth Symphony Orchestra, a 60-piece regional orchestra where kids actually did well. I think you will recall on one of the Wednesday evening worship services, we heard a violinist who had landed a seat with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. A call to do those things. A call to get engaged at the national level with the United States Pharmacopoeia. All of these things, as I chaired that, to get medicine's named and get them into a modern format for where we are now. So that was a call. That was what I told my teacher. What I would tell my mentor, Pastor Jeff, you have made a difference, not only in my life, but in the life of people in this congregation, in the life of people in this part of the county. You have made a difference. You have answered the call that God has given you. We don't have to be wealthy. We don't have to be well educated. We don't have to be that dedicated. But our calls all include doing something that will allow us to care for the people of God and to care for each other and to worship God in spirit and in truth. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a hard week, but let us go forward with the call that we have. Let us go forward with the mentor and with the pastor, with the friend and with the counselor that we've had. And let us continue to give thanks to the Lord our God for this experience. or this congregation. Amen.
Amen.